Welcome, friends. So here we are, part one on the history of tea. And with me today, I have Emilie Jackson, and she is the owner of Emilie's French Teas, located at 8131 Warnell Road. She traveled around the world learning about different teas. So welcome, Emilie.
Thank you. Thank you, Magda. I'm so happy to be here. Yes, I really like this class because I like to really explain where the tea come from and how it really expanded in so many different countries and how everybody kind of adapted to their own taste and culture. So I think today, hopefully, everybody who's listening will learn a little bit more about tea and where it come from and how it evolved around the years. I'm ready when you are. Let me know.
Yeah, I'm ready. We can go.
Okay, so during this presentation, really, you'll learn a bit about the dried leaves of the Camellia Sinensis shrub and how it's been used for medicinal purpose and brewed to create an aromatic, soothing and refreshing drink that we call tea. It originally come from China, and it has been most widely consumed beverage in the world after water. Actually, it's really the second beverage after water. From Japan to England to Morocco to Russia, there is a really complex blend of art, culture, and tradition. That's why I think it's the most fascinating about this one plant. It's how it's really captivating the love of so many people. So, as mentioned, in this class, you'll see how tea came from China and slowly arrived in Europe in the 1600s. But before, I wanted to talk a little bit about the legend. So, there are many legends regarding tea and how it's been discovered, but one of the most famous legends, it's about this Emperor Shen Nong, that also is known as a divine harvester and known as to the agriculture god. He was very strict about his hygiene and only drank boiled water, but he also was someone so interesting in plant in general. And he liked to explore and try to different plant to see what are their medicinal purpose. So the legend says that in one of his herbal walk, he decided to take a rest under a Camellia Sinensis tree, which you can see on this painting, while his servant was boiling some water to drink and to quench their thirst. Some dried leaves from the tree above fell down into the boiling water, maybe because it was windy or something. And the emperor, also well-known herbalist, was intrigued by the delightful fragrance and decided to try the very first infusion of tea leaves that had been created by luck, I guess. Shannon took a sip and found it refreshing and smooth, but also really praised the property of this plant, which one of it is about digestion. Really, the origin of tea still from today is the true origin remain a mystery, but I really like how this story plays an interesting twist. If you look around the world, there are other legends, and one of the legends that was in India and in Japan is the legend of the Prince Bodhidharma. The prince, this venerable prince, traveled from southern India to China during the reign of Emperor Zhu Huangdi, preaching Buddhism in the kingdom of North Wei. He was a fervent advocate for meditation and the cultivation of the mind, and also the elimination of all illusion as the path to salvation. The prince also made the vow to meditate for 7 years without falling asleep. At the end of the 5 years, he was really overcome with weariness and sleepiness, and a providential act made him gather a few leaves from an unknown tree and chew them. Of course, from the legend, it happened that these leaves came from the tea tree. And the amazing virtues of tea gave the prince the strength to fulfill his vow. After 5 years of mental immersion, it appeared that he could no longer, he was able to actually, after chewing those leaves, was able to feel refreshed or invigorated, and his tiredness evaporated, or at least that's what the legend says, and he could keep his vow. So that's one of the legend in Japan, and in India it has a little bit different twist, but both of them, if we look at it, what's interesting is goes back to China. It's when he went to China to learn about different Buddhism philosophy that's where he discovered the plant. So I think it's interesting that it always goes back to China, the origin of where the plant comes from. But what I really like the most after all my study, and I really realized, is how wherever we look around the world, and when we talk about tea, from Asia to Europe to Africa, there are three main health benefits that is always talked about. One is the health, and the fact that tea has this capacity of alertness. Like if you look at the Buddhist monk between the 9th and 11th century, they actually used tea as being able in their practice because they realized it helped them stay steady and awake during their practice. The other thing that we see a lot in many countries, especially in countries where with a lot of heat, is that actually tea quenches your thirst and is also refreshing. And the third part that a lot of people mention is the relaxation aspect. How when we think about tea, we think about being soothing, being meditative. So that's one thing that myself I've checked different study, and it does show that this tea has this not only for drinking it, but the fact that you take your time, especially if you do loose leaf tea, to be in the present moment and to take the time to do a break for a little while. It's really helpful and for your mental health. So one of the things that I like to look history-wise, and it's also explained you a little bit how different countries have different way to prepare teas, is how the different dynasty in China have had different style of brewing the tea leaves. So during the Tang dynasty, it was more like a teapot style. Some people could say even like a concoction. So you would really do that over the stove and let the water boil. And depending on the size of the bubble of the boiling water, you would be able to know what temperature is even best for one tea to another. So that's why we're talking about in the 600 and towards the 900 here. It became a royal drink, and the nobility adopted as an elegant pastime as well. And the poet Lu Yu, in between the 700 and 800, wrote a holy scripture of tea. That's actually one of the first books that was ever written about tea. At what time the tea leaves were used to concoct a medicinal brew, and I talked about how really tea has so many different health benefits, including, of course, digestive, but also is good for heart health and another thing like the alertness, the relaxation aspect. And then later, how it's in the Song dynasty, you can see here in this illustration that it actually looks more like when you prepare matcha, the same type of teaware. So at that time, tea was grinded and prepared, powdered, and you would add the water and you would drink. Basically, you would eat and drink the whole leaf. And then in the Ming dynasty, they re-explored other type of teaware and how it's steeped. So the Ming dynasty and if you look at my cursor here, you can see that looks like a gaiwan. If you're familiar with certain the type of the Gongfu Sha ceremony that is done more in tradition to make Chinese tradition to prepare tea. And steeping tea is now most all the time how we prepare tea in so many cultures. We use more teapots for us, but so that's pretty interesting to see how this type of techniques evolved and what country kept one or the other to actually prepare tea. So how, tea little by little stayed in the country of origin, but little by little kind of expand from the country of origin to other countries. Well, it's obviously traveling and people exploring and trying this beverage. In Japan, there are two Buddhist monks that are known to have made an impact and have pushed the discovery of tea in their country. One is Saicho, who was a Japanese Buddhist monk. His story is that he was credited with founding the Tendai school of Buddhism based on the Chinese Tentai school that he was exposed during his trip to Tang, China, beginning in 800. He founded the temple and headquarters of Tendai at Enryakuji on Mount Hiei, which is near Kyoto. And he also is said to have been the first to bring tea to Japan. After his death, he was awarded the posthumous title of Dengyo Daishi. And then around the 1191, the Zen priest named Myoan Izai, the founder of the Rinzai school of Zen Buddhism, which is a second Buddhist monk that also had some kind of impact on how to, increase consumption of tea or develop the consumption in tea in China and the cultivation of tea in Japan. He brought tea seeds and bushes back to Japan from China and planted some of them on the southernmost island of Kyushu. He shared seeds with a friend who in turn planted them in the Yuji Hills outside of modern-day Kyoto, an area that is still really revered today for its high quality and expensive tea. Izai is credited with popularizing tea drinking in Japan during the Kamakura period, which is between the 1185 to 1300. After many visits to China, he actually used his experiences growing and drinking tea in China to write the book Hisai Yogiki in Japan. Or roughly translating as drinking tea for health. Izai to Japan was actually Lu Yu is to China in terms of advocating for tea. And while Lu Yu proposed rules for proper cultivation, brewing, and drinking, Izai weaved medicinal and healthful benefits with religious ideology without much concern of aesthetics. So they did both have different take on the brew, on this wonderful thing. So let's talk about a little bit how it arrived in Europe and really who discovered tea first. Sometimes, one of the most, the country in Europe that we know most about tea culture is the British. But I bet maybe a lot of people didn't know that the first one really to discover tea were the Portuguese. They were big travelers and the first traders to enter the Far East which is the first. They were the first to bring tea, spices, and porcelains back to Portugal. And then it was the Dutch traders who first created the habit of drinking tea in the West in the early 17th century. And that's how France and also Great Britain arrived. It's really interesting how everything is intricate when it comes to this beverage. There is so much history behind it that sometimes people don't realize. But I want to really talk about Portugal, especially for two reasons, because it was the first one really to discover tea, but also that was the one who helped and made discover tea in Great Britain. So think about it, at that time, everything was about power and about territory. And Catarina de Bragança, who was a Portuguese princess, actually married Charles II. So when Catherine de Bragança married Charles II in England in 1662, she brought in her trousseau a basket of tea leaves. She used them to throw tea parties actually at the court. And these parties were such a success that actually tea drinking became a fashion that endures still now in Great Britain. So it's interesting how everything is intricate, but also going back to Portugal and how it played a leading role in the trade with the Far East after Vasco da Gama discovered the seaway to India in 1498. It was one of the commodities brought from the Orient by the caravels, where the dry leaves of the plant came from. The Portugal, another kind of interesting fact is the Portugal called these leaves in their infusion cha, after the Cantonese word cha, compared to the Dutch rivals who preferred the word from China's Fujian province, tea, with tea actually. So the Netherlands, we can really give them the credit to actually make tea more available in Europe, thanks to being the pioneers and their Dutch East India Company founded in March 1602. They delivered the first major shipments of teas from the East in the 1600 in 1610. And in the 17th century, because they were traditional able seafarers and key map makers, they began to trade with the Far East. And as the century wore on, they gained an increasingly dominant position in world trade, a position previously occupied only by Portuguese and Spanish. And the Dutch were pioneers in bringing tea to Europe and the Western Hemisphere. And they, with France, were at one time the top tea drinkers there. Isn't that interesting? Because if you think about France, I know a lot of you didn't know that we actually have a culture with tea too. It just faded away for historical reason, and now is reappearing again. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the fact that the French and the Dutch primarily had some kind of monopoly when it comes to distribution didn't really, the British really didn't like it. So they got into their act with tea rooms, aging out of pubs at the most popular places to go from some liquid refreshment. And little by little, Great Britain also got their float, and we'll talk about that. And we'll take some advantage in the trade war, if you will, trade game. So the French, for them, they really started to discover teas in the mid-1600s. And it was really primarily drank by the court and the bourgeoisie. because it was highly taxed and not that available for, I would say, more the popular mass in some ways. So as early as 1639, Cardinal Mazarin regularly consumed tea to treat his gout. In fact, some doctors used the tea to prescribe their health benefits, especially for digestion and other things like gout, for instance. And tea was quickly adopted by the wealthy and enjoyed at the French court. And the French adored the elegance of a cup of tea, choosing pristine china and gastronomic delicacies to pair with the healthy beverage. In fact, the china, the porcelain from China was really revered in France. And during a long time, nobody knew how to do porcelains. It took quite a lot of effort to actually make our own porcelain. And now we have a city actually that is, porcelain is named after it. It's La Porcelaine de Limoges. But China had really the expertise on this domain as well. Some authors joke that tea drinking suffered the same fate as Marie Antoinette and King Louis XIV, as the tea leaf was really a drink for the elite, and it met the guillotine, which I think is part of truth, because if you think about it, and if you look at the timeline, tea arrived in the 1600s, mid-60s, and the French Revolution was in the 1700s, and everything associated with aristocracy was not well welcomed. Now, there are other, I think, historic facts that came into play for why the tea in France kind of is really in flux, and then had a decrease during the 1700 and 1800. Is that we in France had colonies where the cultivation of coffee was predominant. So coffee was accessible for everybody and was less expensive. And then we also had cacao. So this kind of competed with tea, and the accessibility of it made it maybe kind of unfortunately disappear a little bit during those era. It reappeared in the 1900s after the Boston Tea Party and the resolution of the taxes that were so high. And now in France, we have old tea rooms that date back to the 1800s and 1900s. And we have many tea rooms around the country with different style and different appeal. So regarding the British Empire and tea, well, I'll talk to you a little bit about how, thanks to Catarina de Bragança, tea really started in arriving in the British court. But there are obviously other more economical interests that the English had with tea, right? Because tea was used as a currency. It was traded like spices and everything, so, and it had a good value. So the British really were looking at how they can make the most of it, and how they could have a little bit more. They didn't want China to have the monopoly, and they tried to see how they could actually cultivate it in their colony. When they saw that in India, the climate was ideal to actually cultivate tea over there, they started to bring the plant and try to grow the tea plant. But it took several years because they didn't have the know-how. So it's not only having the plant, but it's how do you grow it and how long it takes to really make a good tea. So this was one part of their try to make it, but also as mentioned earlier, the foundation of the British East India Company to actually have a bigger impact on the trading market helped a lot. They took over the trade market in the 1696 over the Dutch and the French. which obviously put them really higher in the game. And the introduction of tea plantation in India in the 1800 was a second step to help them even more, having more, I would say, profitability, and also economically being able to be more competing with China, because they were able to trade tea from India and from Sri Lanka, which is even today still one of the two countries that there is a lot of cultivation of the Camellia Sinensis Assam, which it's another type of cultivar that is really appreciated around the world and used in multiple blends. So as I mentioned, the tea really had a key role in history. It was used and measured. You can see in this picture that's actually a compressed tea leaves, which if you look at tea now, you could think that it looks like pu'er tea, which is one of the 6 categories of tea. The pu'er is often compressed like that in bricks, or it looks like disc. There's different way to process it. And it's highly oxidized, and but also fermented. It's one of the only one, depending on the process that the producer do, that has fermentation. So it's also really good for your guts because it has probiotics. As you must know, the US has a history with tea, and the most important thing is the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, that really was basically being against the high tax that the Great Britain was imposing to them and other countries. And that was kind of to express their discontentment and also their independence with them. So the Tea Act from 1773 was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain, and the principal objective was to reduce the massive amount of tea held by the financially troubled British East India Company in its London warehouse, and to help the financially struggling company to survive. That was one of the main goal of the Tea Act. The fact that the Boston Tea Party helped actually overthrow the highly taxed that was for tea really helped make tea available for not only the hierarchies, but in the bourgeoisie, but for everybody. And this what really helped in the long run in some countries like France and everything to be able to have another resurgence afterwards. Another interesting fact that I really like to mention is, especially in France, you had a lot of tea room where only women would take part, and they were really trailblazer and try to do really good things for the country. It was kind of another area that we don't talk much about, how tea rooms where was the women also had their time to talk about affairs as well. Well, this kind of, and there's so many much more things we can talk about the history of tea, but I think it's really interesting to look at how now tea around the world has been used in so many different cultures and different tastes. I like to look at in France, most of the tea we drink, we don't use milk, for instance, or sugar. We just drink it as is. If you go to India, you've heard of the masala chai, for instance, spice tea. So they use the spices from the Ayurvedic medicine, and they add black tea. If you go to Japan, they focus more on green tea, and there is a whole ceremony about it. If they do green tea, powdered green tea like matcha, or if they prepare more essential. If you go to Africa, there's so much some area of Africa will put milk because it comes back to history and the colonies, and some others will just drink it straight. If you go to Morocco, they use the green tea and they add fresh mint leaves. So we can go on, and there's so many more to talk about, but that would be 2 hours of history. So I hope you like the class, and I will thank you for listening. And if you have any question, you're welcome to email me and ask me anything you'd like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, Emilie's French Teas is located at 8131 Warnell, and she has a wonderful selection of the best teas of France. Thank you so much, Emilie, and see you again next time. Take care.